To John Crowe Ransom, Subtle Doctor. Preface. The South is the region that history has happened to. Richard M. Weaver, 1958. Richard Malcolm Weaver was born in Asheville, North Carolina. A child of the Piedmont upcountry, he was the great-grandson of the Reverend Jacob Weaver, 1786 to 1868, the patriarch of the Weaver connection whose descendants continue to gather each summer at Weaverville, the family seat in western North Carolina. Dick Weaver was educated in Asheville and Lexington, Kentucky. In Lexington, he went on to study at the University of Kentucky, where he earned his undergraduate degree in 1932. He then moved to Nashville, Tennessee, to do graduate work at Vanderbilt University, from which he was granted his master's degree in 1934, after writing a thesis directed by John Crowe Ransom. Weaver left Vanderbilt without completing his Ph.D., but his thought had been profoundly changed by his stay there. After 3 years of teaching at Texas A&M University, Weaver was strengthened in his determination to finish his professional education and to round out the sequence of studies undertaken at Vanderbilt. In the fall of 1940, he therefore entered the Ph.D. program at Louisiana State University, and by 1943 he had completed his dissertation titled The Confederate South, 1865 to 1910, a study in the survival of a mind and a culture, which was directed by Clenth Brooks. After a brief stint of teaching at North Carolina State University in Raleigh, Weaver was hired by the University of Chicago, where he taught for the rest of his life. Through his long years of teaching and writing in exile, as he would say of the Vanderbilt agrarians who went north, and his steadily increasing influence as a national figure, Richard Weaver remained a self-conscious Southerner, a man and scholar who remembered his origins, and was certain of his identity, even while his mind ranged far afield from Weaverville, North Carolina, and indeed from the South as a whole. In his lifetime, Professor Weaver published Ideas Have Consequences, a principled defense of one form of intellectual conservatism and the ethics of rhetoric, a closely related group of essays on the dynamics of language. At his death, he left in press a book on political philosophy, Visions of Order, and he was revising the textbook that would become Rhetoric and Composition. Upfront Liberalism, a representative selection of his most wide-ranging and characteristic essays, appeared in 1965 and was followed by a second book of his studies in rhetoric, Language is Sermonic, in 1970. In 1987, a collection of Weaver's Southern essays was published by Liberty Press in what should be his last book. All of this work has markedly influenced the revival of philosophical conservatism in the American Academy, as well as deepening and enriching Southern studies and the discipline of rhetoric. During the last decade of his short life, Weaver's visibility in and out of the Academy increased as some of his best essays and reviews appeared in Modern Age and the National Review. Today, much of his work is in print, and his reputation remains high. The foundation for these essays and books was laid in The Southern Tradition at Bay, a history of post-bellum thought, the revision of his dissertation, The Confederate South. Donald Davidson, who had taught Weaver at Vanderbilt, pointed this out in the foreword that he wrote to accompany The Southern Tradition at Bay when it was first published in 1968. This study had by then endured a long, precarious existence in manuscript. The dissertation from which it was drawn had long been known by influential scholars and recognized as seminal. Weaver himself had modestly, even diffidently, set the manuscript aside after it was rejected by the University of North Carolina Press in the mid-1940s. But he obviously continued to believe in its originality and rightness, for he did not destroy the manuscript and kept it near at hand. Now, some 46 years after it was first written, 26 years after its maker's death, and 21 years after its long-delayed publication, the Southern Tradition at Bay more than justifies Weaver's faith in it. Today, this study enjoys the status of a familiar and often remarked component of the region's intellectual history, a history whose earlier stages constitute its subject. Despite its deservedly high reputation, the Southern Tradition at Bay will have been out of print for more than a decade when this republication occurs. With this reissue of the study, no defense of the value and importance of Richard M. Weaver's work need be advanced. Neither does it seem appropriate for the editors to demonstrate in detail the extent to which Weaver's intellectual development derives from what he learned in investigating this segment of the South's cultural history. Therefore, we have dropped the original preface, Professor Davidson's foreword, and Paul M. Varnell's bibliography of Weaver's publications. Aside from having a few typographical errors corrected, we have made no changes in Weaver's text. As was said in the original preface, we have followed the scriptural injunction in editing this work. Nothing has been added or taken away. Signed, George Corr and M. E. Bradford. Introduction. All studies of American civilization must recognize the strong polarity existing since early times between North and South. The government of the United States was founded on abstract propositions. The facts of varying topography, climate, and race made regional development inevitable, the regions arriving at their own interpretations of the propositions produced on the political level, sectionalism. These circumstances have posed a problem for writers who sought to characterize the United States, and the problem has been solved in the only way possible. That is, by taking the mentality and the institutions of the majority section as best entitled to the name American. I expect to speak of the South, therefore, as a minority within the nation, whose claim to attention lies not in its success in impressing its ideals upon the nation or the world, but in something I shall insist is higher, an ethical claim which can be described only in terms of the mandate of civilization. In its battle for survival, the South has lost ground, but it has kept from extinction some things whose value is emphasized by the disintegration of the modern world. This work concerns itself with a tradition, which means a recognizable pattern of belief and behavior transmitted from one generation to the next. Traditions must have, of course, a sufficient coherence to be distinguishable as integers. Yet in characterizing a tradition as Southern, one encounters the same difficulties as in characterizing another American. Within each, there will be dissidents and minority reports. It is plain that there were things done in the South which were not Southern, and things done in the North that were not Northern, as we are compelled to understand these terms. Really, we are faced with a problem in logic, and it is enough, I think, to be aware of the fallacies of composition and division. The first is an assumption that what is true of a part, or even of a number of parts, the proportion being incapable of determination, is necessarily true of the whole. The second is an assumption that what is true of the whole is also true of every single part. To say that Southerners have differed in point of view from Yankees does not speak for every single Southerner, but it does express a substantial truth. However much it may offend our sense of fairness, it is a demonstrable fact that the group in power speaks for the country, that the element which controls the government, the education, the means of publication, is the nation insofar as its collective action goes. There is truth in the saying that the state is that part of the population which knows what it wants, or better, has a moral ambition. In essaying the Southern tradition, therefore, I have taken the spirit which dominated, and I shall no more apologize for speaking of it than others have for speaking of the New England mind or the American character. It is not the province of this work to discuss early Southern abolition societies or the spread of French infidelity in Southern educational centers, save to the extent that they called forth, or served to illuminate by contrast, that unified and preponderating mind which produced the Confederate South. If asked to tell why in these days Southern history is entitled to thoughtful consideration, I should list first of all the fact that the South, alone among the sections, has persisted in regarding science as a false messiah. This by itself indicates that the Southern tradition has a center of resistance to the most powerful force of corruption in our age. While the Western world has gone after false gods, it has clung, often at the cost of scorn and insult, to its lairs of the field. More concretely, it has not, in the same measure as progressive sections of the country, become engrossed in means to the exclusion of ends. The precarious state of our civilization has grown with our control over nature, though we were promised an opposite result. We have assembled a vast warehouse of machinery which would, it was hoped, if not minister directly to the civilizing spirit, at least free other forces for that ministration. Yet this spirit shows signs of failing. The signs were in evidence before the world wars, and everywhere crassness, moral obtuseness, and degradation are on the increase. We have been led to believe that man's chief task is the conquest of nature, including, of course, space and time. Mere advances in mechanical power, and especially superior mobility, have been greeted as steps in an automatic progress. The thought was plausible enough to find wide acceptance, so that now it is a dogma with which the clever can exploit the unthinking. Perhaps indeed its great attraction lay in the emancipation from thinking. Science was hypostatized. A great machine appeared to have been set in motion which needed only operation to produce a civilization beyond present conception. It is easy, while occupied with techniques and under the influence of robot-like labor, to forget that the most difficult task is to train and govern men for their own good. The painful truth is now beginning to emerge that a flourishing technology may make civilization more rather than less difficult of attainment. It leads to mobilization of external forces. It creates enormous concentrations of irresponsible power. Through an inexorable standardization, it destroys refinement and individuality. Other things it does too, and now, with the greatest of all wars behind us, which we fought with the least enthusiasm and settled amid the greatest moral confusion, it behooves us to examine some alternatives. We must see, first of all, that the kingdom of civilization is within. We must confess that the highest sources of value in life are the ethical and aesthetic conceptions with which our imagination invests the world. We must admit that man is to be judged by the quality of his actions, rather than by the extent of his dominion. Civilization is a discipline, an achievement in self-culture and self-control, and the only civilizing agent is a spirit manifesting itself through reason, imagination, and religious inspiration, and giving a sort of mintage to acts which would otherwise be without meaning. A civilized tradition implies a center from which control is exerted, and it is through this control that we give quality to actions. Civilized man carries a sense of restraint into his behavior, both toward nature and his fellow beings. The first of these is piety, the second ethics. Piety comes to us as a warning voice that we must think as mortals, that it is not for us either to know all or to control all. It is a recognition of our own limitations and a cheerful acceptance of the contingency of nature which gives us the protective virtue of humility. The attitude of science, on the other extreme, has become impious to the fullest degree. It has encouraged a warfare between man and nature, a fanatical warfare, in which without clearly defined war aims we seek the total overthrow of an opponent. But nature is not an opponent, as ancient systems of belief could have instructed us. It is the matrix of our being, and as such scientists, we are parricides. Piety is a realization that beyond a certain point, victories over nature are Pyrrhic. The thought is implicit in the legend of Prometheus, and I have no doubt that the deep suspicion with which medieval theologians viewed early explorations of the physical world was intuition. They sensed, apparently, the peril in these conquests, a hubris leading to vainglory, egotism, impatience, a feeling that man can dispense with all restraints. Every legend of man's fall is a caution against presuming to know everything, and an indirect exhortation to piety. And the disappearance of belief in original sin has done more than anything else to prepare the way for sophistical theories of human nature and society. Man has lost piety toward nature in proportion as he has left her, and shut himself up in cities with rationalism for his philosophy. And here enters one of the alarming facts of our cultural condition. It is the spoiled child psychology which appears in all urban populations. This malady, described by Ortega y Gasset in The Revolt of the Masses, afflicts any people who have lived so long in an artificial environment that they have lost a sense of the difficulty of things. Their institutionalized world is a product of toil and discipline. Of this they are no longer aware. Like the children of rich parents, they have been pampered by the labor and self-denial of those who went before. They begin to think that luxuries, though unearned, are rightfully theirs. They fret when their wishes are not gratified. They turn to cursing and abusing. They look for scapegoats. If the world does not conform to our heart's desire, some person is guilty. So runs their tune. Liberals of the type who think for the nation and the new republic are in a constant state of vexation over the unmalleability of the world. The agrarian South, close to the soil and disciplined in expectation, has never behaved as the spoiled child. It has suffered more afflictions than Job, but has continued to call God and nature good. It accepts the unchangeable and hopes that it is providential. As a result, the backwoods southern farmer does not feel as sorry for himself as the better-heeled, better padded and more expensively tutored northern city cousin. This acceptance of nature with an awareness of the persistence of tragedy is the first element of spirituality, and a first lesson for the poor, bewildered modern who, amid the wreckage of systems, confesses inability to understand the world. If asked whether the South has any genuine claim to be considered aristocratic, I would say yes. And this is it. The South has kept something of the attitude of the soldier. Aware of the battle, he has only contempt for the tender, querulous, agitated creature of modern artifice, sighing for the comforts he is entitled to, and protesting that the world cannot really be like this. I'm sure that Lee, so reserved in expression, so wise in thought, had this in mind when he called self-denial the greatest lesson to be learned. If part of our happiness comes through transformation of the outward world, another part comes through the pruning of desire, and we return to the original proposition that civilization is a matter of inner conditioning and adaptation. As piety respects the mystery of nature, so ethics, the restraining sentiment which we carry into the world of our fellow beings, respects the reality of personality. It is well if our code of ethics has a religious origin, so that its power to impress derives from some myth or some noble parable. Its purpose, in any case, is to lead everyone to a relatively selfless point of view, and to make him realize the plurality of personalities in the world. Above all, it must insist upon the rightness of right and keep in abeyance the crude standard of what will pay. A Southern writer, thinking to reflect upon the Yankee Benjamin Franklin, asserted that honesty is not a policy at all, but a principle. The jibe was perhaps unmerited, but there is peril in promising temporal rewards for the things we must do out of profound ethical belief. It will seem to many anomalous that a slave-holding society like the South should be presented as ethically superior. Yet the endeavor to grade men by their moral and intellectual worth may suggest a more sensitive conscience than prescription of individual differences. I do not claim that the South did this successfully, but the great intellectual effort which went into the defense of slavery indicates an ethical awareness and established some conclusions not yet entirely refuted. More important than this, however, was the astonishing resistance to the insidious doctrines of relativism and empiricism which the Southerner carried about with him. It was manifest in his religion, it showed in his deportment, and it became conspicuous in his conduct of war, as I shall illustrate in the text. Many Northerners had similar conceptions, but I believe fair-minded students of America will admit that in the North, conditions were arising which made maintenance of these difficult. They were precisely the conditions which had drawn from Burke the cry, "The age of chivalry is gone. That of sophisters, economists, and calculators has succeeded." It is a remark whose truth has increased with the years. The North was in the first stages of commercialism, and no way has been found to reconcile this with ancient ideals of honor. Personality can develop only in a humane environment, and nowhere in America has this distillation of life flourished as in the South. Its love of heroes, its affection for eccentric leaders, its interest in personal anecdote, in the colorful and the dramatic, discounted elsewhere as charming weaknesses, are signs that it reveres the spiritual part of man. It has instinctively disliked, though it has by now partially succumbed to, the dehumanizing influence of governments and factories. Individualism and personality are making a stand, perhaps Augusta's last stand in the South. Civilization is measured by its power to create and enforce distinctions. Consequently, there must be some source of discrimination, from which we bring ideas of order to bear on a fortuitous world. Knowledge and virtue constitute this source, and these two things, it must be said to the vexation of the sentimental optimists, are in their nature aristocracies. Participation in them is open to all. This much of the doctrine of equality is sound, but the participation will never occur in equal manner or degree, so that however we allow men to start in the world, we may be sure that as long as standards of quality exist, there will be a sorting out. Indeed, we are entitled to say categorically that unless such standards are operative, civilization does not exist, or that it has fallen into decay. That no man was ever born free, and no two men ever born equal, is a more sensible saying than its contrary. To the extent that the South has preserved social structure and avoided the creation of masses, It has maintained the only kind of world in which values can long survive. A society in the true sense must have exclusive minorities of the wise and good who will bear responsibility and enjoy prestige. Otherwise, either it will be leaderless or its leadership will rest on forces of darkness, for there is little difference between the tribal chieftain who wins his place by brute force and the demagogue of the mass state who wins his by appeal to mass appetite. The man of a civilized tradition, therefore, will find nothing strange in the idea of hierarchy. Out of the natural reverence for intellect and virtue there arises an impulse to segregation, which broadly results in coarser natures, that is, those of duller mental and moral, refined at the top. Schemes to control this process or to expedite it, such as Plato's system of education, testify to our sense of its wisdom. The terms society and mass are really antonyms. One implies an intelligible order with the best elements where decisions are to be made, whatever the mechanism of selection may be. Mass is shapeless, impotent, really unintelligible. Because it depends upon an ordering of qualities and places, civilization is in fact a protest against this featureless condition. The notion that all ideas of rank are inimical to liberty is found only among those who have not analyzed the relationship between freedom and organization. It is the process of leveling which distorts reality and leaves us with a situation that is, literally, impossible to conceive. The most assured way to undermine civilization is to surrender to criteria of uniformity and objectivity, losing sight of the fact that the objective cannot be prescriptive and failing to make those distinctions which have their basis in human ambition. True, it requires a degree of tough-mindedness to accept the fact of civilization, just as it requires sternness to execute moral laws, for both are discriminatory, and many forces which would destroy it have been abetted by men of goodwill and have come creeping in among us, appealing to blind appetite, to special interest, and capitalizing on a partial awareness of what is at stake. We cannot do better in this connection than ponder the wonderful speech of Ulysses in Troilus and Cressida. Just as the deep mind of Goethe grasped the true significance of the French Revolution while the jejune and the half-educated were being misled, so the marvelous understanding of Shakespeare saw in an instant the consequences of a classless society. Oh, when degree is shaked, which is the ladder to all high designs, the enterprise is sick. How could communities, degrees in school and brotherhoods in cities, peaceful commerce from dividable shores, the primogenitive and due of birth, prerogative of age, crowns, sceptres, laurels, but by degree stand in authentic place? Take but degree away, untune that string, and hark what discord follows. Each thing meets, in mere oppugnancy, the bounded waters should lift their bosoms higher than the shores, and make a sop of all this solid globe. Strength should be lord of imbecility, and the rude son should strike his father dead. Force should be right, or rather, right and wrong, between whose endless jar justice resides, should lose their names, and so should justice too. Then everything includes itself in power, power into will, will into appetite, and appetite, an universal wolf, so doubly seconded with will and power, must make perforce an universal prey, and last eat up itself. And this is Shakespeare on nihilism. Milton, too, it would seem, though a fierce republican and a foe of absolute authority, believed that, quote, orders and degrees jar not with liberty, but well consist. It was a denial of such propositions that shocked Southern political thinkers. They could not understand how anyone, looking at the face of society and cherishing values, which must always appear tyrannous in the divisions they enforce among men, could preach equality and ridicule the veneration of age and eminence. Such views tended to break down the organization of the world and to substitute a lawless competition of unequals. Those who seek to evade this dilemma by declaring that ability alone should count, a natural plea in our age of specialization, are often disingenuous, for they narrow down ability to mean some special skill, aptitude, or ingenuity at an isolated task. But in the political community, ability must take account of the whole man, his special competences, plus his personality and his moral disposition, even his history. It is well that people are not ranked for measurable efficiency, as engines are for horsepower, but rather for the total idea we have of them. Thus again we face the topic of the whole man, and the evil of reducing him to an abstraction to ensure his political qualification. Southern political theory was a rationale of society. The Northern theory it was designed to confute was largely a set of aspirations unrealizable even logically. It was a political romanticism, not then subject to severe testing because the Northern world was fluid and expanding. Every old and settled society comes to terms with the physical world and the psychic world, and it forms a judgment that efforts to change either beyond a certain point will cost more than they will yield. The South was in the position of Europe or even Asia. It felt that it had discerned some necessary limitations of existence. The North felt that the South was compounding with ancient evils. Hence the epithets were fool and villain. The North had Tom Paine and his postulates assuming the virtuous inclinations of man. The South had Burke and his doctrine of human fallibility and of the organic nature of society. A difference so wide is not easily composed in any country, and in the United States there were aggravations. It is a wonder that the South did not draw more freely from Burke, who understood clearly the power of sentiment in civilized communities. A culture defines itself by crystallizing around what I should call unsentimental sentiments. These are feelings which determine a common attitude toward large phases of experience. They impel us on critical occasions of life to sense more than we would sense and do more than we would do if we were only economic man. There is no demonstrable connection between them and our physical survival, and therefore from the standpoint of materialism or nihilism, they are excessive in the same way as any sentimental display. They originate in our worldview, in our ultimate vision of what is proper for men as higher beings, and they are kept from being sentimental, in fact, by a metaphysic or a theology which assigns them a function understandable through imagination. The propriety of any given sentiment will rest on our profoundest view of life. Our attitude toward the dead, toward traditional institutions, toward the symbols of community life, all come from a metaphysical dream of the world which we have created or have been taught. It is the loss of this view and the determination of matters in a narrow context of material interest. Let us recall the horror with which the direct, practical judgments of a successful moneymaker are greeted in a family of inherited refinement, which mark the subsidence of our power to support civilization against the will of outward being continually pressing upon us. Burke saw the French Revolution as an assault upon just such conceptions. All of the pleasing illusions which made power gentle and obedience liberal, which harmonized the different shades of life, and which, by a bland assimilation, incorporated into politics the sentiments which beautify and soften private society, are to be dissolved by this new conquering empire of light and reason. All of the decent drapery of life is to be rudely torn off. All the superadded ideas furnished from the wardrobe of a moral imagination which the heart owns and the imagination ratifies as necessary to cover the defects of our naked and shivering nature, and to raise it to dignity in our own estimation, are to be exploded as ridiculous, absurd, and antiquated fashion. Speaking for a century which had valued men for their correct sentiments, Burke contended thus for the spiritual character of society against sans-culottism. And looking at our own Second American Revolution, we find the South charging the North with lack of sentiment. A Northern professor resident in the South has written that Southerners apply the term Yankee as the Greeks did barbarian. The kinship of ideas cannot be overlooked. The Greek knew that the barbarian could not participate in his luminous world of myth and actuality. The sentiments of a culture may indeed be delicate arabesques of convention, the appreciation of which demands a state of grace. Their value will lie in their non-utility, in their remoteness from practical concerns, which keeps us from immersion in the material world. So the Southerners who belonged to the tradition thought they saw in the leveling spirit of the North, in its criteria of utility, in its plebeian distrust of forms, in its spirit of irreverence, and all of these must be mentioned with apologies to Northern people whom they do not characterize, a kind of barbarian destructiveness, not willed perhaps, but certain in its effect. There is a point of view from which the sentiments and formalities of civilization will appear absurd, and many Americans, especially those close to the frontier, have fancied a virtue in taking it. But a frontier is by definition not civilization, and the unbought grace of life thrives in a different environment. The destruction of sentiment leaves us not animals who have their own nobility, but ruined men. Considerable importance must therefore be attached to the Southern fondness for pleasing illusions. The Southern mind has been sufficiently conscious to recognize subversive influences, by which I mean anything tending to undermine that moral or sentimental order constituting civilization. We can explain thus its reaction to French rationalism, and in a more limited field to German higher criticism. The instance of Jefferson has led to a supposition that French radicalism found hospitality in the South. To the extent that it was linked with the cause of American independence, this was true, but when that cause had been won, and the South began to consider its necessities and the more permanent arrangements of peace, libertarian and equalitarian doctrines languished. It has consistently exhibited a distrust of social programs initiated on the basis of hypothesis. One could go further and say that the South has a deep suspicion of all theory, perhaps of intellect. It has always been on the side of blood and soil, of instinct, of vitalism. Something in its climate, in its social life, predisposes it to feel that grey is all theory and green is life's golden tree. To say that the South had a rationale of society is not to say that it favoured what has come to be known as rational planning. On the contrary, it has held that society, though of intelligible structure, is a product of organic growth, and that a tested modus vivendi is to be preferred to the most attractive experiment. George Fitzhugh expressed the belief in an epigram when he wrote, "Philosophy will blow up any government that is founded on it." And today, when the South pleads to be allowed to work out its own problems in its own way, it more often than not has no plans for working them out. Its way is not to work them out, but to let some mechanism of adjustment achieve a balance. It is this which has clashed with the North's impulse to toil, to help the world go around, to have a rational accounting of everything. Undoubtedly it has relation to the attitude of piety, which would respect the course of things, and frowns on a busy human interference with what nature seems to have planned or providence ordained. The German mentality was only a little less suspect than the French, and German neologism, as it was termed, was viewed as the most dangerous solvent of religion. Learned investigations into the historicity of a religion are not, as time has proved, a means of encouraging reverence for that religion. A religion may be indifferent both to history and to reality of the plebeian sort, which is the reality of correspondence to the visible world. Its origin may embrace things fabulous, and its doctrines may incorporate paradoxes. It would be easy to show indeed that the power of Christianity over long periods and in varying intellectual climates lies in its candid acceptance of the paradoxes of existence. This means that its appeal will be to the moral imagination and its endorsement through our experience of life. Literalism is the materialism of religion, and this materialism too, except in the crudest exhibitions of fundamentalism, the South has shunned. At the same time, it looked with disfavour upon New England's voyages into seas of transcendentalism and Unitarianism. And if it is asked which course has best conserved religion as an active principle in life, we must admit that here again the South chose right. It viewed these as England viewed continental skepticism, and the fact that modern decadence, political, social, and moral, began in continental Europe indicates where the instinct of survival lay. Despite sins which are as scarlet, the South has remained a Christian country in that it has persisted in describing the relationship of man to the universe in religious symbols. Naturally, the South did not see these trends as we can see them today, but I think that Southern churchmen of the educated group came close to seeing them. These men were intensely conservative, therefore they had a point of view. In times of profound revolutionary change, it is not the liberals, the progressives, the social democrats who discern what is at issue, as I shall invoke Leon Trotsky to witness. It is the men of the old order who see most clearly the implications of the new. The failure of values, the dissolution of traditional bonds, the fragmentation of life, which were but as signs then, were nevertheless pointed out. No full diagnosis of the disorder was made, and probably there was none capable of making it. A growing sense for the last 50 years that civilization is at a crossroads, deepened by collapses of astounding violence and consequence, has inspired a greater study of the condition of man. In presenting evidence that this is the traditional mind of the South, I am letting contemporaries speak. They will seldom offer whole philosophies, and sometimes the trend of thought is clear only in the light of context. Yet together they express the mind of a religious agrarian order in struggle against the forces of modernism. A final word about what is included. Since this work is the history of an articulate tradition, it is concerned almost wholly with published materials. The first chapter describes dominant forces in the tradition, and here the task was chiefly to outline. The Southern Apologia is important as showing the reasoned case behind the vague but diffused and persisting sense of injustice felt by people of the section. Military history and autobiography bulk very large in Southern literature, and no one acquainted with the history of the South will omit the influence of the soldier. Indeed, an inventory of the mind of the soldier is very nearly an inventory of the Southern mind. It was principally through fiction that the post-bellum South secured a hearing from the country and the world. Trends in this field, therefore, reflect much. The last chapter relates the South's entrance into the 20th century and explains the point of view of forces opposing the tradition. In the epilogue, I have sought to draw the moral. The simple process of preserving our present civilization is supremely complex and demands incalculably subtle powers. Ortega y Gasset.